Welcome back to AM Northwest. You know, June marks 100 years since world-famous explorer George Mallory died on Mount Everest along with his climbing partner. The new book, Fallen, explores what happened during that fateful expedition while separating the man from the myth. We welcome award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker Mick Conefrey. Mick, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing very well. It's this afternoon, actually, because I'm in Oxford in England. Or would you rather me say it's this morning?
No, you're fine. You're totally fine. It's okay. We appreciate you chatting with us. The book is really fascinating. First of all, though, for those who don't know George Mallory, talk about the myth that a lot of climbers know about him.
Well, what makes Mallory interesting is nobody quite knows what happened to him on Everest. A lot of people believe that he was the first person to reach the summit, getting there about 30 years, 29 years before Ed Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing. But other people think that it would have been impossible for him to get there. And that mystery has never been resolved. So that's a kind of fundamental question about him. But he was a fascinating character. Many different aspects to his life, and he was a very intriguing guy, you know, cultured. A lot of his friends were painters and writers and artists of different sorts, yet he was also thought to be one of the great mountaineers of his era. So and I think everything from his name, which almost sounded like a kind of Arthurian hero, to the way he looked. He was very handsome, and people constantly remarked on this, made him into a kind of quintessential hero. And like all great heroes, he died young. So he has that James Dean, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin quality to him, that there's a sort of, he never grew old.
He was very much a risk taker. You talk about in the book, you start out with him on the beach as a kid, and he took risks even as a kid.
Yeah, I mean, you know, his biographer, first one, his friend David Pye, said he was the kind of person who couldn't get behind the wheel of a car without trying to overtake the car in front of him. And he was constantly getting into scrapes. He didn't have many accidents in terms of falling on mountains, but he did have a few, you know, because he took risks. So it was very much part of his character from childhood. There's a kind of story of him as a 7 or 8 year old going out into the sea and sitting on top of a rock and watching the tide come in to see how high it could go and whether he would survive it, and his parents and grandparents on the beach looking on in horror until he is rescued. So I think, you know, from the beginning of his life, he had that risk-taking gene built into him.
When he took on that expedition, a lot of things went wrong. So talk to me about, he took on a partner. Some people complained that Andrew Irvin, is that right, was not the best person to take with him. What are your thoughts?
One of his failings, as some of his friends pointed out, was that he tended to overestimate the capabilities of others. When he got married, he wanted to take his wife to the Alps to go climbing. And a friend of his says, no, I don't think you should do this. I don't think she's ready for this. She hasn't got any experience, you know. And recently somebody else from their friendship group, another couple, had actually died in the Alps. And so he saw sense at this point. But throughout his life, he often would take on people who weren't at his level, perhaps thinking that, you know, he was so good that he would be able to kind of haul them up, you know. And Andrew Irvin, who was his partner in June 1924 on the fateful climb, he had very little experience mountaineering. His forte was he was a rower. He had rowed for Oxford, had been in the boat race, would have rowed in the famous boat race in 1924 if he hadn't been to hadn't been to Everest. And he was a very strong, very young, very kind of capable individual, but he did not have a lot of mountaineering experience. And so a lot of people were very surprised when Mallory chose him.
When his body was found, it was found like with his arms outreached, as if he was reaching for, you know, the next level, which is he just made it before the summit, right?
Well, not quite.
Okay.
When his body was found, there was very much a sense that he was trying to stop himself falling.
Gotcha.
You know, and then the people who found him in 1999, the American team, were really struck by this. That he didn't look like somebody who'd given up or who had been beaten. He looked like somebody who had been falling down, constantly trying to stop himself, holding on to the mountain to for dear life, you know. So that was they were all struck by this, that he sort of almost become part of Everest. His body literally frozen into it, his hand stretched out as if to the last minute, he was trying to stop himself from falling.
What is it that you want readers to take away?
Well, I think there are a lot of myths about Mallory. As you say, he's very famous. There have been lots of other books written about him. But I think there are lots of myths about him being, you know, for example, one of them is that he was simply an obsessive character and couldn't stop himself. And there's a bit of truth to that, but equally there's another bigger truth that, in a way, what's interesting about him is he's a kind of person at a moment of crisis in his life where he has been to Everest several times. Everybody is applauding him as the greatest climber of his day, but there's lots of part of him is saying, no, I don't really want to go. You know, by this point in his life, lots of other things were happening. He'd got a new job, he'd got a wife and family, he'd been away during the First World War, he'd been on 2 previous Everest expeditions, and he was what's interesting about him, this is a story of a man at a real moment of pressure in his life and how he reacts. And but it's also very much a kind of detective story because, you know, all the time you're trying to work out, well, look, we've got all these little clues about him, both in terms of what he wrote, the letters he wrote home, and also what was found on him and where he was found in 1999, and trying to get that detective story to work to say, well, what can we conclude about it? And, you know, for example, one of the things is that there was a debate in the early 1920s amongst his friends and contemporaries as to whether he had actually stopped and turned round, because he did at a certain point realize that Irvine, his young companion, wasn't really capable and had kind of done the sensible thing, but nevertheless still fallen, as opposed to the kind of received wisdom, which is simply, oh, well, he was an obsessive, he had what you call summit fever, he couldn't stop himself from keeping on going. That's the kind of received image of Mallory. But I think what I found was a lot of evidence to say, well, no, actually, maybe that's not the only truth of it, and maybe actually it makes more sense to see him as somebody who, in this kind of moment of crisis, moment of drama in his life, had matured and had become a responsible kind of person.
Mick, it's absolutely fascinating. I want to tell everyone the book again is called Fallen. Mick Conefrey, thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much, and have a good morning.
We'll be right back with more AM Northwest. Don't go away.